Chapter 14. The Waterman's Arms. Jim woke up before Granny Nick. The river was overflowing with mist and seemed to be breathing with secrets, with dark, looming shapes. When the mist cleared, they bloomed into life, like a city, street upon street of boats. He could see downriver to the long silver gleam of water, under the dark arches of a bridge, and he knew that far away from there it flowed out into the sea. He imagined slipping the knot of the lily and drifting downstream with her, past all the floating castles of tall sailing ships and out to the huge ocean. When Grimy Nick lumbered up from his dark hole, he swore at Jim for letting the fire go out. "You'd think we didn't have any coal on board, you fool." He laughed at his own joke, a great startling whoop of laughter that set Snipe leaping up out of his sleep. Jim tried to laugh with him. "Get water from the yard," Nick snarled. "Start the day off right." When Jim came back with his slopping pail, he found Nick toasting fish by the fire. He threw a piece in one direction for Jim and some heads in another direction for the dog. Then he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and belched. "Work," he told Jim. "When we clears this lot, we goes out for more. Off one of them big boats. So don't think your work's done. Your work's never done. Not while there's coal in the ground." It took them the whole of that day to clear the hold of coal. Jim thought every bone in his body would break before he'd finished, but Nick kept grimly on, shoveling and lifting and tipping, shoveling and lifting and tipping. His body a grunting shadow swinging across the glow of the lantern. "Work," Nick shouted at him whenever he paused to rest, swinging his shovel round to crack across the boy's back. Jim struggled to keep up with him, and when he rubbed his eyes, the grit of the coal dust smarted and stung him. By the end of the day, he couldn't see what he was lifting or where he was tipping, and no sooner was the basket winched up than he was shoveling coals into an empty space and being shouted at by Nick for his stupidity. But at last the hole was empty. Nick went up to the desk in the warehouse to get his payment, then came back on board, jingling the coins in his pocket. "You're only a bundle of sticks," he said to Jim, "but you've worked. If you want a bowl of mutton stew, come with me to the alehouse and I'll see you set up." Jim was so tired he would have rather slept, but he reckoned that Nick's invitation was meant to be some kind of compliment, and he didn't dare turn it down. He stumbled after Nick, and the dog loped between them, turning its yellow eyes first to one and then to the other. The Waterman's Arms was dark and noisy, with a low blackened ceiling and lanterns hanging from the beams. It was thick with smoke from the fire in the hearth, and from the men and women who were puffing away on pipes. Grimy Nick pushed his way towards a crowd of men who all wore large metal badges like him to show that they were watermen. They whistled in contempt when they saw him, but he only laughed at them in his loud, sharp way. "This is my midget, little Jim here. Show him your muscles, little Jim. Didn't know he had any, till he came to work alongside of me." He patted Jim's head in a fatherly sort of way and told him to find a stool by the hearth and to keep quiet. The barmaid set a bowl of hot stew in front of Jim and a small draught of ale. He could hardly keep his eyes open now. Before he was halfway through it, the noises around him softened into murmurs and spread across a wide, dark sea, lapping as quiet as long ago. He was slipping into the sea, which wasn't sea at all, but a cradle with soft, warm cloths, and it was rocking him as if he were a baby. There was a crash, and he woke up with a start to find himself lying face down in the sawdust, his bowl of stew broken and spilt. Nick lifted him up and swung him across his shoulders, and Jim was carried out, past all the laughing, upturned faces, and propped up on a bench in the dark, with Snipe growling at his feet. "Wait there," Nick grunted and went back inside. Jim was glad to be outside, with the air cold and smarting on his cheeks. He could hear grimy Nick's voice inside, loud and boastful, his quick, surprising bellow of laughter. He was joined by other children, all squatting or standing in a silent line, waiting for their masters to come out with their food or their pay. Jim puffed himself up a bit. He was the only child there with a beer pot in his hand, even if he did think it tasted like copper coins. He wished he could have his hot mutton stew back. "You with Grimy Nick?" one boy asked. Jim nodded, taking a swig from his pot and scowling at the bitterness. "His last boy was took to hospital," the boy muttered. "Beat to bits." "Won't beat me," said Jim, full of beery bravado. "I'll beat him first." The other children giggled into their hands at this, turning knowing looks at each other. They were a miserable lot of scarecrows, Jim thought, sipping again at his ale. Some of the children slept where they waited, leaned up against each other. One group, roped together, told him they were a field gang and they were going to go with their gangmaster to dig up turnips on farms. They were led away at last, and one by one the other children ran off with their coins in their hands. At last Nick came out, breathing bad temper into the cold night. "Jim, it's time for you to take me home," he bellowed, as if Jim was 2 miles away instead of standing right next to him, and he leaned his weight on Jim's shoulder. Together they made their slow way to where the lily was moored. Nick stumbled down to his gritty bed in the hold and snored like a foghorn all night. It seemed as if Jim had only just gone to sleep when he was kicked awake again. Nick, yawning and coughing, pulled him to his feet. "Move," he shouted. "Tide's turning." Jim staggered up. A fluttering of excitement lit up like a small candle inside of him. It was time for them to move downstream. Beneath his feet, the lily was rocking round, soft as breaths. Jim ran to the wharf and fetched water, and Nick knocked on a cottage door and came back with hot bread wrapped in a cloth. By this time the tide was steaming underneath the boat. She nudged round to face downstream, and Nick threw her rope on deck and jumped on board. Jim's dream had come true. They were heading towards the sea.